Welcome here, it's time to make new friends. Aquavite Uskava, fill your Glencairn. Share a dram with the spirit of Edmonton.
Sláinte. And good day, whiskey brothers, whiskey sisters, and whiskey friends, and welcome to the Whiskey Book Club's, what is this, 23rd book of Season 5 with, it's the second book, Season 5, 23rd book in all, and we're with Dr. Nicholas Morgan, author of this book right here, Everything You Need to Know About Whiskey, but we're too afraid to ask. And as always, I'm honored to have you, the viewer, with us here today as well. And really, where else could you delve so deeply into the subject of whiskey than here with the author? So, my name's Dolph. I am the Spirit of Edmonton on social media platforms, founder of the Whiskey Book Club, and your host tonight. For those of you that are new to the Whiskey Book Club, I'll explain a little bit of what we are. It's a home base. It's a safe place for whiskey geeks like you and me that love to share a dram. Sometimes not at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, but that's what we're doing today. And share a passion for reading, and mostly about whiskey or whiskey-related books and activities. Now, this book, and I'll show you again, is, as I said, the 23rd book reviewed on the Whiskey Book Club. Nick's second book. Here's the first book, A Long Stride, and hopefully we'll talk about this one in the future. And Nick, I hope you're not easily embarrassed because this is a long bio. So, Dr. Nicholas Morgan was a University of Glasgow professor of Scottish history before he became the United Distillers archivist. So, and again, United Distillers created from DCL and Guinness when they came together. This was a newly created position just for him. He headed the team and based at Krabby's Warehouse there. Now under the Diagio umbrella, he was very active, became one of the first to recognize and tap into the specialists and kind of the collector's market. That's all him. The global marketing director of Single Malts in 1997. He managed the rare malts program and the Distiller's Edition range. He created Diageo's training course called the Malt Advocates course, and he was an instrumental element in the decision to reopen Port Ellen and Brora distilleries. Pretty great. That's a great bio. Welcome, Doc.
Thank you.
Today. That was quite a bit. But a lot to reel off. You've been a busy man for 30 years, kind sir.
Well, I was very lucky to be in the whiskey business for 30 years, and you know, when I joined, I was asked to set up a historical archive, as you said, for United Distillers, who realized, or a couple of people in that business realized in the sort of fallout from the merger between the DCL and Guinness, which some people may or may not be aware was not necessarily a regular business transaction, and it ended up with people going to jail and all sorts of things. And it was a terrible mess.
I can't remember that. Okay,
and
I want to hear more. Okay,
these guys realized that a lot of the sort of history of the company had been lost during that sort of 3-year period, really from 87 to 90, and it had been lost because lots of people had left, and of course your people are sometimes your very best resource to know what went on in the past. And also historical artifacts had been lost, stolen, thrown out. I mean, just a terrible mess, really, for a company of that scale and size and such importance, not just sort of from a business perspective, but huge importance culturally in Scotland, you know. So I came in to do that job. I'd been teaching history at Glasgow University, and I was teaching sort of modern history, business history, and urban history sort of stuff. But I never imagined that I would end up doing what I did do. So it's just been a fantastic journey for me. And you know, I left just at the end of 2020. And that was time enough. I think 30 years. It's a great ride.
And then right into authorhood. Did they headhunt you, or did you apply for a position? Did you hear about it, or did someone approach you about it?
No, I was headhunted. There was the people in United Distillers who wanted to make this happen and who got the resources and budget to do it,
Yeah.
were clever enough to put together a sort of small consultative committee of 3 historians.
Okay.
One was the late Michael Moss, and some of you may have Michael's very famous book that he wrote with John Hume, The Making of Scotch Whisky.
Okay.
One of the others was a gentleman who's also sadly not with us anymore, Ron Weir, who wrote the history of the Distillers Company from 1877 to 1930. And then a man called Ted Hopkins, who was an agricultural historian from the University of Reading. Oh. And they put together a small list of names, and mine was one of the ones on it. So I was very lucky. Very lucky.
You. Fantastic. And, well deserved. We say lucky, but you worked to be in that position of luck. So good for you. Let's start with the inception of this book, if we could. So Every, Penguin, Random House, and the Whisky Exchange. So I'm wondering how they came together, and then finally how you were involved in this. So if we can separate the two first, how they came together first.
So some of this I know, and some of this I don't know. So I'll tell you what I know, and that is that Ebury, who are part of Penguin Random House, do what I think they call partnership publishing.
Okay.
So they try and find partners who will work with them and jointly, I think, finance or underwrite the cost of, relatively speaking, specialist publications. So it might be about food, it could be about whiskey, it could be about cars, automobiles, or whatever it is. So there was someone at Ebury who was my editor on this book, who was very keen on whiskey. And she persuaded her boss that there was a space for a whiskey book
out there. Yeah.
And they approached the Whisky Exchange. Now, they may have approached other people as well, I don't know, but they approached the Whisky Exchange. And Sukhinder Singh, one of the 2 brothers who founded and were at that point running the Whisky Exchange, I think and his colleagues were very keen on that idea. So they had some sort of confab with the Ebury people, and they came to some understanding about what this would look like in terms of the commercial deal, which I was not party to, so I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
And then Sukhinder was asked to suggest an author, and I got a call from someone that worked for Sukhinder saying, would I go and have a chat with them? And they explained this project to me. I don't know if I was the first person on their list or the last person on their list, who knows? But we had a long chat. And it was really interesting because actually they didn't have any idea what they wanted the book to be.
Okay.
I think Sukhinder was really keen to have a Whisky Exchange book that would last, would stand the test of time. So not a book that comes and goes, but one that would be there on people's shelves. And he wanted a book, I think, that dealt very generally with whiskies, and certainly not one, or at least I wasn't prepared to write one that was tasting notes and all of that stuff, because there are so many of those, and the good ones are very, very good, so why even try and compete with the people that do that stuff? So I then went and spoke to Ebury, and it turned out that they didn't have much of an idea of what the book was going to be either. So I sort of had a blank piece of paper. So I went away and I sort of came up with a sort of schematic of what the book could be like. In the end, it actually turned out that I think 3 or 4 of the sections didn't get written because I wrote too much. And
that's the second.
Yeah, and I wasn't going to cut any of it out, so a few things were just ditched as we went along. So I gave them a proposal. They looked at it. Sukhinder and his people looked at it. Ebury looked at it. Ebury shared it with their commercial people, and everyone said, "Yeah, this is great. If you can write this, if you could, actually, I think it was if you can write this in about 5 months,
please,
this would be great." So.
Well, let me interject for 1 second, and I'm just going to put a quote up. So this is what Sukhinder's goals were in the book. So this is in his introduction. So write about all aspects of whiskey that We discuss every day at the Whiskey Exchange and over drams when we meet up with friends. So there's 5 elements that I have. So the debates, the myths, the whiskeys that inspire us, who we admire, and that might have been you as opposed to him, and what we like to change if we could. Now, was that a discussion between you and Sukhinder, or you and Aubrey, or everyone involved to try to nail down what we want?
I think it was everyone, and certainly I was keen to do some myth busting.
Okay.
And I'd done some myth busting, I think, in the Johnny Walker book, but there was still quite a lot to do. So I was keen to do that. Actually, the one thing that Sukhinder, although he didn't tell me who, well, he did actually tell me who to an extent, but he was really keen to celebrate the people.
Okay.
And he was very keen to celebrate some of the people who he felt he owed a great debt to in terms of starting his business and being successful. And 2 of those were Jack and Wallace Milroy of the famous eponymous shop in Soho, which they now don't have, for a long time have not had anything to do with. But Sukhinder was very keen to get Jack and Wallace in there. And although Wallace died some time ago, I was introduced to Jack when I was writing the book, and he was, first of all, very helpful, and also incredibly funny. My goodness. Conversation with Jack Milroy is sort of your eyebrows coming over here, some of the things they got up to. So Sukhinder was keen particularly keen on the people. He said, whoever you like, but I just want this to sort of acknowledge, and that was fine for me because I've been very lucky. Some of the people I've worked with and people who've inspired me in the business. So they're all in there, and some I like, some maybe I don't like so much, but you can't always like the people you respect and admire. It comes.
Well, that's true, and we don't think of it in those terms generally.
No,
but yes,
no.
When you finally meet those that you've read or admire, and it's like, ooh, okay,
yeah,
it's very interesting. You're terribly bright, but I don't think I would get along with you.
Never meet your heroes
That's what they say.
I not as much now as I used to, but about 5-10 years ago, I was going to 2 or 3 rock and roll gigs every week.
Okay.
And I always made a rule of not hanging around behind to meet these people. I wanted to hear them play and hopefully enjoy it, and then get out and go home. Just leave the dream there as it is.
Well, my dream for authors was Broom, and because my first influx into whiskey, I think he was the first author where I read his book, and then I took his World Whiskey Masterclass. I don't know if you remember that, but he did one. So many sessions. So I spent probably 40-50 hours just watching him and his individual tasting notes. So he was kind of up there, and I've been hoping to meet him, but then the same thing with you just said. What happens if he's no longer on that pedestal afterwards? I've got all these books by the man. What do I do?
Dave's a really wonderful guy, and if you can get, he's just working on his Whiskey Atlas update now. And of course, it's very interesting because if you think of what the whiskey world was like when he first wrote that book, and compare it to what the world whiskey map is like now, he's got so much work to do.
So, I interrupted you before. I didn't find out how you were brought in by Sukhinder, though. So how did he kind of bring you into the fold? He said that they wanted someone that was in the industry, but not how you actually talked about it.
Sukhinder and I have known each other for a long time, and and I think have had a very good and respectful relationship. So we didn't always necessarily agree, and at times when I was working for Diagio, I had to have some difficult conversations with him, and that there would be disagreement around that, but there was always also a lot of mutual respect, and I understood where he was coming from. He understood where I was coming from with my sort of Diageo industry hat on. And I certainly made the point very strongly when we had our first discussions about the book that it just didn't make sense to me that all these books were written about whiskey, and there are many, and some are good and some are less good, but almost none have been written by anyone who understands how the industry works. Okay. And believe me, you may look at the industry from the outside and think it's A, B, C, and D, but I can tell you it's E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, and probably a few others as well.
And I'm guessing that comes out a lot in this book.
Somewhat, but I mean, if you think about the Everything You Need to Know book, there's a lot about the whiskey industry today. There's a lot about the business of whiskey, which I think is really important for people to understand. And things like that, and really you need to have a view inside to understand some of that, and also some of the production things. I didn't break any trade secrets, but I think often people don't fully understand what goes on, don't fully understand, how the process by which whiskey is made and then finds its way into a bottle and then into a carton, like some of the ones you've got behind you on your shelf, and then into a liquor store. So it was look, let the book be written by someone who first of all understands broadly the science of whiskey. I mean, I'm not the best science person, but broadly understands all of that side. Certainly I would say I'm a sort of A class on history.
You should. Yeah.
And I can do pretty well on taste and stuff like that, and I can also I was given room to provoke some people as well, so just upsetting a few people is always quite good if you write a book. So we
yes,
there were a few,
and like you said, you were myth busting, and we do when we'll talk about the business of whiskey as well, because you do go in detail with that. But I'm wondering, were there any secondary goals? So myth busting being one, was there something else because you get the opinions of fellow authors, which I don't know if I've seen in other books. I don't think I have. I've read a substantial amount. Or establishing for the reader who they should be looking to for information. Because Billy Abbott had his section, books to read, but you've got a fantastic section, books to read, but through the eyes of these other whiskey writers.
So it's two things there, Dolph. The first one about the other people involved. When I sat down and thought about it, and thought about Sukhinder's view that he wanted a book that was really broadly representative. Mm-hmm. It did seem to me that although I was very strong on, I'm the guy from the industry, I thought we should try and get some other voices in there of people who had perhaps slightly different perspectives, and particularly on certain topics. So whiskey finishes, there's a debate. Okay, there's a debate. Finished whiskey. So let's ask some people, not just my point. I mean, I have quite a strong point of view, but let's ask some other people and see what they think.
Yes.
Favorite author. Ask some people. What's the best glass to use? Let's ask. That's one of the most stupid debates of all. But I mean, we had that one. So I'm lucky that over the years, through the work I've done, through the travel I've done, whiskey festivals and all this sort of stuff, I've met a lot of people and have got pretty good relationships with them. And so I put together a sort of panel, and they all got the same questions, and some crop up quite a lot because I got really nice answers from them. Others perhaps slightly less so. But these are all people whose opinions I respect, because I wouldn't have put them in the book otherwise. Sukhinder was very happy to have them all involved, and I think they, I hope people don't get fed up listening to me talking for an hour and a half. But sometimes when you're reading a book like this one, you can get a bit fed up with the one author. So it just brings a bit of variety into it as well.
I thought it was novel. I loved it. I liked it a lot. And all authors that you'd heard of, if you're in the industry, so I think that was great. Thank you for that. Yeah. There was the quote on the screen. I want to finish that for people. And so Sukhinder wrote this in the introduction, and he mentioned his goals for the tome and why he chose you. So I wanted someone who came from a different side of the industry. I wanted someone to look at things from both the brand owners and enthusiast perspective. And of course, someone who could write eloquently. That's very nice of them, and really knew what they were talking about. So let's use that as a segue to talk about you, Sukhinder's choice, and put you up on your rightly deserved pedestal just for a moment. So there is a quote on page 231 as well. In the chapter Whiskey People, you state, occasionally someone, like the author, arrives just by happy accident and never leaves, a bit like an unwanted guest at Christmas. So I'm assuming that we're talking about you. Can you tell us what your happy accident was. Was it just the introduction to that job, or were you into whiskey prior to that? Because I'm guessing you must have had a love to be brought into the industry prior to that.
Well, so let's deal with the well, a happy accident. Actually, that's an easy one. That the happy accident was being asked to go and speak to these people about the job with United Distillers. You know,
perfect.
And that's one of those things. That was a real life changer. Yeah, in every respect for me, not just a career changer, life changer. The enthusiast thing. Well, I was I was. It's interesting actually. I was mentored into drinking Scotch whiskey when I was at university.
Okay.
My dad drank Scotch whiskey, not a lot, but he always had a bottle in the house. Where we lived in England, in North Oxfordshire, there was a very large American Air Force base close by called Upper Hayford. And a lot of the pilots, senior pilots, lived in the same little village that we lived in, and they were friends and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And whether it was an explicit policy to sort of have good relations with the local community, but my dad kept on being given bottles of Johnnie Walker Black Label, okay, and also Dimple, 12 years old.
Nice.
Both of them.
I like Dimple. Yes.
Yeah, no, Dimple's very nice. And or Pinch, as it was called in the States. And at the time, it's still in the 70s, these whiskies were still not that easy to get hold of these are 60s, sorry. Whiskies still not easy to get hold of. And Johnnie Walker Black Label was not 12 years old in the UK.
Okay.
Because they still hadn't made up the inventory, this long inventory drag from the Second World War. So my dad had whiskey, so I knew about it, but he never gave me a glass. At university, I was mentored into drinking whiskey, and I think it's interesting to look at the world in 1973, and this was in the north of England. I was at Lancaster University.
Okay.
And I was mentored into drinking Scotch whiskey by some of my history professors, and we drank Bell's blended Scotch whiskey.
Okay. That
was considered to be pretty sophisticated and grown up in 1973. Of course, when I went to work at Glasgow University, which I first went there in 1980,
okay,
I fell in with quite an unruly crowd of academics.
Nice.
Including the aforementioned Michael Moss, who was working and researching and writing about Scotch whiskey. So that was I think that was my second lesson in really understanding what Scotch whiskey is about. And then I got to understand a lot more about blends, but I also got to understand a lot more about single malts. Okay. However, having said that, and also one of the projects I had worked on at Glasgow University was called the Dictionary of Scottish Business Biography.
Okay.
And it's 2 volumes, it was published in the end, 2-volume series of biographies of Scottish businessmen active from about 1840 or 1830 through to 1960.
So many distillery owners.
There are a lot of distillers and blending people in that. And although I actually didn't do any work on them at the time, I was editing and reading as well as doing the stuff I was doing. So I sort of got a taste for the history of it, and I got a bit of a taste for the drink.
The taste.
However, I would not say that I was an enthusiast. And I'm not even sure if I'm an enthusiast now.
Okay.
Because when I go to whiskey shows, which to be honest, now after 30 years of whiskey shows, I wouldn't be sorry never to go to another one. But when I do go to whiskey shows now, which I'm sometimes asked to do, I'm astonished to see the level of interest and excitement that people have to try all these new things and, weird and wonderful 3-year-old whiskies from new distilleries and heaven knows what. And that's what I call real enthusiasm, because of my age and my relationship with whiskey is that I want to taste the things I know that I like. Okay.
But you've had a lot of whiskey to try. And within and you've had such a role that you've played within the industry as well. Like the distillers editions are phenomenal. We love those. And that was your baby. You started that.
No, I didn't start it. No,
Oh,
no,
I
no.
thought you did.
No, Distiller's Edition was started by a guy called Mike Collings, who was also one of the two people responsible for the Classic Malts. And
Okay.
I worked with Mike on the Distiller's Edition, and he moved into another role, so I picked it up. But
Okay.
the actual start of it and the concept, as it was all done by Mike. I mean, I had rare malts and then introduced the special release program. So 10 or 12 special releases each year. Normally we'd be looking at 5 or 6, sometimes more samples from each one. So, I mean, I've over the years, my goodness, I've tasted some astonishing whiskies.
I'm imagining. And
Yeah.
and the logistics behind 12 releases or more every year with the stocks that you had at the time was pretty incredible as well. And so people can read the book, buy the book, read the book to find out. But the logistics behind that's important. Your role within the industry is important, I think. So you diminish it a little bit, but really, if you weren't there, I don't know if it would have gotten to the point, if it would have been as well received as possible. You were a single malt proponent at that point. Prior to that,
oh yes, yeah, and still am. I mean, I'm also a blended Scotch proponent because the two are so intrinsically linked. You can't have one without the other, But which was one of the things again in the book. I wanted people to try and understand that, Yes, of course, single malts are great. In my opinion, blended Scotches are great as well. But you would not have single malts unless you had. Oh yeah.
Well, that's me today. I had to comment on the side what's in my glass. So I've got a blend and I've got a single malt. I've got both today because of you, actually, kind sir. Otherwise, I have a lot to choose from Diagio. I've got such a large choice, and I was going to say it's because of Diageo that I became a whiskey lover. When my son was born in 1994, I had what's the name of all the small bottles of the single malts from all the regions. It was, you just mentioned it.
The Classic Malts of Scotland miniatures, yeah.
And Oban became my favorite from that list. And since then, I've always had a bottle of Oban in my house, starting in 1994. And when the children were a little bit older is when I got more into it. It's all because of Diageo, and it's all because of their focus on single malts at the time, other than Glenfiddich. Because I like Glenfiddich just fine, but it wasn't moving for me. And the introduction of the single malts was fantastic. And that was my introduction into peat as well, both. And I love peat. And it's all because of that one series. So that was 87, I think.
Yeah. So as I say, two gentlemen, Mike Collings and someone called Roy McMillan, were the two principal people behind that, did all the work. And I think, and I know because I've had these conversations with Dave Broom, Charlie McLean, and people like that. There are very few people who would disagree that it was that Classic Malts, the idea of a mixed case of 6 different single malts. So if you were an account, if you were a bar or a restaurant or a pub, you could become a single malt specialist overnight with this one case. And also this, some people listening may remember a really nice, what we call the plinth, that you put the 6 bottles on, have it on the front of the bar or have it on the back bar. One of the most effective pieces of point of sale in the Scotch whisky industry, I think, ever created. You still see them around. You go into bars and things, people have still got them there.
Really?
And that really, I think, blew open the category. Really brought the idea of variety and difference. And this idea that somehow these things taste like they do because of where they come from and all of that sort of stuff, suddenly became a lot more accessible to a lot of people. And they were launched in duty free in 1987. Then they went into specialist shops, specialist liquor stores, wine and spirit merchants. And then in about 96 or 90, it'd be about 95, 96, they started to go into broader distribution.
Okay.
So into multiple retail outlets. And it was actually then that the Classic Malts Distillers Edition, which you mentioned, that was created at that point so that specialists could still have something that was sort of their own, rather than competing with the bigger retailers.
Okay. We're still in the introductory phase of all of this.
Right.
I still haven't really gotten into the book all that much, but I still have to ask you this question. So your development as a writer, so as a professor, you wrote your thesis, but beyond the thesis, after that, did you have any urge to write until 25, 30 years later, when you're about to end your time at Diagio and then become a writer and write this, your first book?
Okay. So yeah, all my thesis stuff is in the other room. This is all whiskey books around me at the moment. So I did my thesis. That was published. I sort of edited it a little bit, and that was published. Then when I went to Glasgow, I did some freelance writing, some sort of business history stuff for people. And I was involved, as I said, in this publication, the Dictionary of Scottish Business Biography. I wrote about 35 or 40 biographies in that. Okay. And I was writing articles and chapters for books and things of that nature. So, and I carried, actually, when I first went to United Distillers, I carried that on slightly, but it came to the point where it was impossible to do the two things. Okay. So I put the writing mostly on a back burner. I did for a while, occasionally would write for people anonymously or using pseudonyms just to do a few things. But really, the writing just had to wait. Now, I'll tell you one thing, though. In Diageo, and I imagine like most other companies, there's a very clearly defined annual review program, performance review. What are you doing well? What can you do better? Right. What should you stop doing? All those sort of conversations that we all have with our bosses. And part of that was also what are your aspirations? So from some point, I don't know, it would be about 2005, because I never had any aspirations. Like I say, I was the unwanted Christmas guest, so it seemed rude to have aspirations. But from about 2005, in that little box, I just put research and write the history of Johnny Walker for their bicentenary in 2020, because I knew that was when I was going to retire.
Thinking ahead. Okay.
I knew that was when I was going to retire. So it was like, that's a great swan song.
Okay.
And I discussed it with people, and they went, okay, well, maybe we'll see. And then eventually in
non-committal. I hear.
In 2017, they said, yeah, okay, we'll do this, which was probably a year too late, actually, in terms of the research that needed to be done. Because from the point I started through to the publication of the book, I was probably 80% of my time was researching initially, and then writing. 20% of my time was on other Diageo things that I had carried on having responsibility for. So I was very grateful, obviously, to Diageo to entrust me with that task. I don't think they quite knew what they were going to get, but I do think they were very pleased with it when they got it. And
where would your research have taken you with the extra time, with the extra year?
Well, it actually would have taken me to the United States.
Oh, okay.
That would certainly have been one of the things, and it probably would have taken me to Australia. So, and both Australia first and the United States have a huge part, not just in the history of Scotch. Well, if it's to be honest, and I know some people who think this sounds sort of vain or whatever, but I'm going to say it. If it's the history of Johnny Walker, it's the history of Scotch. If it's the history of Scotch, it's the history of Johnny Walker, right?
All right. Okay.
So Australia.
I'll keep those words in mind as I read this for the first time, because
you'll see when you go through it, you'll understand why I'm saying that, Dolph. Okay. And like I say, I'm not being boastful, but you'll understand that.
You're allowed to be boastful. It's okay. It's all right.
So both Australia and the United States, hugely important for Johnny Walker, hugely important for Scotch, and certainly I had to sort of do that work at arm's length, as it were, which was very difficult. And although I think it's pretty good on the States and Australia, I think there maybe are some other things that would have come out of the woodwork. as it were.
Were things well documented in both countries, or would you need the extra time because they weren't, and you had to delve deeper and deeper and deeper?
It would have been principally going over to work on trade publications which are not available online.
Okay.
So if there's any genealogists listening to this call, they'll know that newspapers really are now have astonishing online availability, digital libraries in the United States, in Australia, and in the UK. But the trade journals, which is where very often a lot of the real meat is, and a lot of contemporary controversy in the 19th and early 20th century about the business and about what's going on and what's being done. That remained pretty close to me for Australia and the US, which was a shame. There was also
a definition of a trade journal for us, please, for those listening. What's a trade journal? How's that different from a newspaper article?
Okay, so if you take the United Kingdom, there were three certainly major spirits-related publications which were produced on a weekly or monthly basis from the 1870s, 1880s. The Wine and Spirit Trade Record, Harper's Gazette, which Alfred Barnard famously worked for, and they published his book, and then one called Ridley's Wine and Trade Spirit Circular.
And this is mostly for people in the business, those that are investing
in the trade. So a lot of it is about the market. You know, what's up, what's down, what can you get, what can't you get, what's going to happen next year, and all of that sort of stuff. So a lot of sort of real trade stuff, but also commentary on developments as well, and a lot of stuff about the people involved in the trade and so on and so forth. And of course, a lot of adverts, so you can see what people are saying about their products, or not saying. In the case of Johnny Walker, frustratingly not saying. But we'll save that story for a different conversation,
or a different book. That when you actually make it to the States and Australia.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what I call a trade publication. And today, the spirits business, which is something we all look at, you know, and things like that. And because they're a bit niche, they tend not to get onto the digital libraries, you know. So,
and where do you get such publications? Because you can get them privately, but then it's pell-mell. It's not a large stack. So where would you go to get maybe 5 years worth in one sitting, one place?
So here you would go to the British Library.
That's it.
So the British Library is the biggest depository in the UK of published material. It's a copyright library. So in theory, they have a copy of everything that's ever been published. Of course, it's not actually the case. So you go to the British Library, you would go to the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. You would go to the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, because there were some smaller Scottish trade papers that they have there. Mm-hmm. And if you were in the United States, you go to the New York Public Library, probably would be one of the things. You might go to the Smithsonian as well for some of this material.
In Washington, yeah. Okay. Yeah. And where did you learn that? I'm guessing it's as a doctor, or when you're doing your research. That's where you learned about these publications, because still it was the history or Scottish history. So I'm guessing that's where it was, and not when you joined Diagio. It was prior to that.
Well, no. So in terms of these trade sources, I'd become aware of their existence, broadly speaking, across every industry when I was doing the work in Glasgow on this business biography project. Right. So we almost had developed a template for where would you go if you were writing a biography of a man who owned a coal mine. Where would you go if you're writing a biography of a man who made whiskey? You know, what are the things you have to check? Good. And we also did a lot of the work as researchers before we even started writing anything. We had done a lot of the work building up portfolios of information for those people who we thought were most important. Then when it came to writing, some of the people who did the writing had not been involved in the research, but they were just handed over the dossier and say, well, here you are. This is everything we found. Right. So although I didn't write about, for example, anyone in the whiskey trade for that publication, I did do a lot of the research.
Okay.
So I've known about these things for donkey's years, you know. And as a historian, you just, this is what you learn. This is what makes a historian a bit different from someone who isn't a historian. You know, it's knowing where to go, knowing where to look, and also having the patience to sit in the British Library page turning. You know, that's the great art. I could look at 600 pages or more in a day, turning.
You
Like,
learn
when I was doing the Johnny Walker book, I could tell you if there was any word on a page that began with WALK, I saw it
right away. Okay.
Yeah, you know.
Well, you become so attuned.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
it. Let's get into the book. So 45 minutes later, we're getting into the book, but this was important, learning about you and your past to get to these books. And I've got to say, in your writing, great, concise, and informative session on how whiskey is made. Now, you said that you mentioned it previously, but I've read many books that go over the process, and it's concise, it's informative, and those of us that have read many prior, I kept reading, because often I stop and you skim it because you've read it before. And well, I have a quote in here as well, but I'll get to that first, and when I reread it, I relearned a few things, which was great for me. So the first word that I hadn't seen for a very long time was a Shoogly box.
Shoogly box, yes.
Now, I've seen these boxes, and again, on David Broom's online training series, the whiskey, he did it on there.
Yeah.
Is there another name for them? Because I don't know if they go by that name if that's the term that they use in the States for bourbon, and then that.
Well, you do know why it's called a Shoogly box?
No, I don't. Please.
Okay, so let's just explain. When you mill the malted barley, okay.
Yep.
And you come out with this grist, as it's called. You take a sample of the person operating the mill will take a sample of the grist and put it onto this box, which has got, I think, 3 layers of wire, each with a different size of hole in it.
Yep.
And this is to help them understand if they've got the right balance between flour and husk.
10%, 20%, 70%.
Whatever it is, each distillery is slightly different, you know, the way they work their plant. So you put it in there, in this little box, literally it's about this big, and then you shoogle it. So the shoogle is the physical act of shaking the box. It's a Scottish word.
Well, shoogle is a verb?
Yeah, to shoogle.
To shoogle. Okay.
Shoogle, yeah.
I'm sorry.
So
okay.
It's a shoogly box, you know?
Got it.
And I'm sure it's probably called the grist sample box or something like that, you know. But it's, you know, and if you do a tour of a distillery, it's always a standard part. You're in by the mill, they show you it, you've got something to sniff or taste, and probably they'll bring out the Shoogly box as well.
So I've seen it in action. I've seen that. I just thought there was another word, but if to shuggle is the verb, it makes complete sense. Thank you very much.
I have to say, latterly, when I visited some distilleries, there's a lot of very scientific equipment to do all of that, but I noticed there is still always a Shoogly box as well, and I think that tells you something about the way distillers like to work, you know.
And talking about distillers, another word that came out was a badger or Joe. So named after the fermenting wort that was once popular as a mid-shift refreshment for distillery workers that you described as, and here's the quote, sweet, mildly alcoholic, and known for having an almost immediately, frankly, devastating effect on the bowels. So as I read this initially, and later I'm absolutely convinced, it was apparent that you had some unique sources when you were referring to these. So you're going right to the source. And we talked about that. It's the journals, but beyond the journals.
No, this is from people that work in distilleries. I spent you know, I was lucky enough in my job to be allowed to frequently disappear from my desk in London and ramble around Scotland at distilleries, meeting people and talking to people. And Joe is one of those things. You know, there's some great. I think there are a few things in here which are from operators and managers of distilleries just telling me things, and they, you know, you hear a lot, but some things stick. You know,
retain.
yeah, there's a great one actually, and a lot of them are. It's like the Shoogly box and the fantastic equipment next to it, but a lot of them are about the sort of science and technical side of making whiskey, and the way it relates to a sort of intuitive side that you might have if you've done the same job for quite a long time. So I was speaking to an operator at one distillery. We were at the spirit safe, and we had the manager was with us, and he was, and I was there. We had a party of guests, so I'm just there. Manager's there. Manager's talking to the guests. He's saying, "Well, this is it. We measure it. We've got things, strength, and all."
Yes.
And he went off with the guest, and I was chatting to the stillman, and I said, "Is that how you really do it?" And he said, "No, it's when it smells of pineapple."
Sorry.
When it smells of pineapple.
That's it. That's when I do it. That's the cut.
And I said, "And what strength is it when it smells of pineapple?" He said, "Well, it's always that strength. It's always that strength." So, you know, it's
how many times has he distilled, and why would you actually? He would know intrinsically. And talking to the distillers here, the same thing. They can tell immediately when it starts going into the tails and how far they want to bring it. It's repetition, and it's knowledge, and it's experience. So I'm glad you asked them.
We tried very, very often to get people when we're taking like writers and, you know, I suppose people might be called influencers now, round distilleries, which I latterly spent quite a lot of time doing. Sometimes with let's say with the brighter ones, you'd say, well, let's not talk our way around this distillery. Let's smell our way. Let's smell our way through the process.
Great.
And some distilleries, just I think because physically just the way they're set up. So Kalila was always a great one for smelling your way through the process. It was always really brilliant. Others perhaps less so, because every bit of it does smell different, you know. And if you get into a still house, they're noisy, you know, you've got a hiss going on, so you've got to sort of cut that out of your head. But actually you can walk around a still house, it's different everywhere you go, you know. It's remarkable. One of the remarkable things about whiskey, I think.
That's really interesting, and I've never done that. I'm going to smell my way through the next distillery, and
well,
we've visited distilleries enough. But
put dark glasses on, or
I'll have my wife bring me through.
And I was going to say you need to have someone. You need to have someone holding your hand and taking you through, and you will have a totally different distillery experience from the normal tour. You know.
All right. Okay, and then at one point maybe no smell and it's just sight. Put the earmuffs on, go from one to the other.
Yeah.
That's terribly interesting. I want to try that. That's good.
I mean, whiskey is a thing about the senses. You know, there's a sensory or sensual and sensory product. You know, in many respects. So you need to open up every bit that you've got to that.
Okay. Another quote. You're going to learn very soon. I have a lot of quotes, I'm sorry, but there's a lot of well-written stuff in here. So it sheds light on a few of the issues that you address throughout the book. And you talked about the whiskey business. So no one makes whiskey without wanting to make money. This is a fact that occasionally seems lost on some enthusiasts who, despite their intrinsic mistrust of large corporations, judge other producers with a naivete that confounds any estimate of their intelligence. It's like a little poke there. At the center of this misty-eyed view of whiskey making is the distiller, or sometimes master distiller. Now, there's certain words that some people have a problem with, and I think that, first of all, you have a matter of fact, a less frivolous view of the industry that you're trying to get across, and I appreciate that. I believe that you want us to see how it really is. Now, is the promulgation of the less glamorized view your intent? Do you want to make everybody not see it in this glamorous way? Or do you want them to still be misty-eyed, but understand at the same time? Or are you trying to do this?
I can tell you, Dolph, no one gets more misty-eyed about whiskey than me. Okay?
So I love it too.
I have whiskey in my heart and in my soul.
Okay.
And there are some places that I go to that are so beautiful that I almost cry because of what they're like. So don't think that I'm just a hard-hearted cynic.
You heartless bastard. Let them.
Yeah,
No.
that's not the way it works. But at the same time, I do not understand why people want to have these sort of illusions, you know. And remember, I worked for the company that everyone loves to hate.
Yeah,
right?
because they're so big.
Company that everyone loves to hate. And latterly in my career at Diagio, I was supposed to take on the haters and try and persuade them that they needed to look at things from a slightly different perspective, you know. And you know, you may have an inherent mistrust of capitalists, and I certainly can understand that. But you know, the capitalists who run Diageo are no more or less capitalist than the capitalists running these small distilleries scattered all over the UK and Australia and, you know, wherever they are.
Yep.
Everyone is in it to make money. That's what it's about. It always has been about. Well, I suppose, yeah, no, I mean, even if you go back to sort of almost subsistence farming distillers in the late 18th and early 19th century, it was still about taking a pretty mediocre crop of barley, if you even managed to get a crop of barley, and turning it into a cash crop.
Or anything you couldn't sell at the end of the year, making sure it wasn't wasted, make whiskey of it, something that you could sell. Or
whiskey was going to get you. No one was going to buy your barley because it was so poor. So literally you had this opportunity to transform it into what we used to call liquid gold.
Yes.
Yeah, liquid gold.
It's gold color.
And a bit of that in your glass during the winter, and maybe a bit of the cash that you got to help you buy seeds for the next year, you know, to help you get a new cow or whatever it might be. That was really important, but it was still all about money. It was still all about money. And I think people do need to see through the
glitz and glamour of it all.
Well, it's not just glitz and glamour. Now it's the holier than thou stuff that we keep on getting, you know, from people. I think people just need to just understand why everyone's there. And then having done that, then you can go and look at the way they're making their whiskey, which might actually be really interesting. And they might be doing interesting stuff with the process or interesting stuff with the raw materials they're using or maturation, and they may be producing really interesting, nice whiskey, you know, great. But don't forget why they're doing it.
For money.
And of course,
they might be creative. They might have a creative side to them and they're using that. Or maybe they hated their jobs previously. And this is a great way to maybe, there's some that retire in Canada that I know. Their retirement was opening a distillery, which doesn't really make sense once they have actually started the distillery. They don't see it any easier. It's a hard gig. But yes, I think people should see beyond that. And they should understand the business. And this book does a great job of it.
Yeah.
Not just the business, but certain terms. And I mentioned that before, the Master Distiller term. So do you think it's disingenuous because they're not all Master Distillers or because of the self-promotion of it all? Let's throw that
I tried to find out where that term came from.
Okay.
And in fact, I've got a whole file somewhere. Sorry, I've got all these Post-its up here of all work in progress that you can't see. Well, I'll show you if you like. It's sort of
yes. Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
that's the inner workings of the mind.
And I'm sure one of those is my. It's a sort of mind map in a sense. I'm sure one of those is my Master Distiller little Post-it, because I actually had thought that the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, Mike Collings, who was behind the Inception of the Classic Malts of Scotland, I thought Mike had dreamt that up because that's very Mike. That's the sort of thing he would do. You know, why have a distiller when you can have a master distiller? That was very Mike.
Got it.
But my recollection is that I discovered master distiller being used in the 1970s, I think in the States. But I was quite surprised. And also the same thing, master blender.
Yep.
So Calvert's, which was a famous American blended whiskey, Had a whole series of advertising campaigns in the 60s, I think, featuring their master blender, talking about their master blender. So the term's been around, master blender and I think master distiller, for a bit longer than I'd realized.
All right. And it's prior to Herit Watt then.
Well, it's absolutely meaningless. It's absolutely meaningless. I mean, you're either a distiller or you're not. You know, nowadays most people go to college to learn how to distill. In Edinburgh very often, and then you're sort of trained on the job, and then there's a point at which you become a distiller, and really by distiller we mean distillery manager. You know, so there are stillmen still, and there are brewers, although it's not a term that's used that often, maltsters, whatever. But the distiller really is the person that runs the show. And ultimately, he or she is responsible for the quality of the spirit that's produced. You know, that's, and of course, today, actually, they're probably almost equally responsible for health and safety. So everyone goes home in the evening safely, you know, which of course is very, very important. But that's a distiller. So when suddenly do they become a master distiller? When they become a master distiller, when a copywriter gets involved, you know, and is doing an advert or an advertorial or something like that. And, you know, you see people now who have been in the industry for about 3 years and they're master distillers. And you go, well, how can that be? Where is their masterpiece? If you think of whiskey, you're going to make a masterpiece. You're going to make it. It's not like making a piece of silver, for example, or crafting something from wood, you know, a piece of furniture, your masterpiece. In whiskey, your masterpiece is probably going to take at least 8 years, right, in a cask before anyone knows if it's any good or not. So it seems to me that there's minimum, you know, sort of, I would always say 12. That's like the benchmark, isn't it? You know, I'd say 12 years. You know, come on, you've got to be doing this for 12 years before you can have earned that master status. And I tell
that's
you,
without learning from your cask. That's opening it at the 12-year mark and assuming that you did it perfectly from the start without adapting at that point.
But I thought the other thing, if I may say so, is that my PhD, which you haven't asked me about, just as well, because we'd have never talked about the book at all. My PhD is about the religious society of Friends, the Quakers, in the 17th and 18th century. Okay. And Quakers detested vainglorious titles. They detested plain, you know, Quakers, plain speaking, plain grey, thee, thou, and all the rest of it. And although I'm not a Quaker myself, I certainly inherited a number of attitudinal things from the time I spent researching and writing with Quakers, because I worked with them for a while. So I just think all of these titles are nonsense. You know, you're a distiller. That's what you do. You're a distiller. You should be proud enough of that, you know. And until there's some tangible, measurable qualification that says now you're a master distiller, maybe it's an exam, you know, maybe it's Dave Broom and Charlie McLean looking at 2,000 samples of the whiskey that you've produced, or whatever it is. Yeah. Until there's something tangible, then really I haven't got much room for master distillers. Or master blenders for that matter. Although I suppose master blenders, it's maybe a bit different because mostly master blenders do have a team of blenders working for them. So I suppose you've got to be in charge, but you could be the head blender. I'd rather be the head blender than the master, you know. I don't like the sound of it.
For me, it was those that went, and this is where I thought the term might have started, but I don't know when Herit Watt started their distilling, the masters of distilling and the doctorate in distilling that they had there. So I was thinking those that had that designation could be a master distiller.
Yeah, no, it's a term that's been dreamt up by marketing, you know.
Okay. All right, let's leave it at that, and let's go to the second word, is the whiskey expert. So Sukhinder pushed away that determination. He didn't want to be considered a whiskey expert, and I'm wondering if I think there are whiskey experts. I think there are people out there that know more than 99% of the other whiskey enthusiasts, and we could call them a whiskey expert. But I don't know what would make a whiskey expert. I would say, if I was talking to you, I would say he's a whiskey expert. If I had a friend, I just talked to a whiskey expert for the last hour on. I would say that. I would say Broom is. I would say, for me, Davin de Kergamo, who I respect fully here. I've seen him so many times. I would say, is there a Canadian whiskey expert? I said he would be the man, I think. So there are some for me, but are there for you? Or what would make one for you?
So,
and Sukhinder's not somehow. I don't know how he wouldn't be, but he doesn't think he is.
I was doing an interview with a journalist from the Scotsman newspaper yesterday about the famous 1823 Excise Act.
Okay,
so 200 years since the famous thing, and they're doing something about it, and they asked me to speak. And we had a very interesting conversation. And at the end of it, the lady I was speaking to said, "Well, what do I call you? Do I call you whiskey expert?" And I said, "No.
Okay.
Whatever you do not call me a whiskey expert."
Okay.
And I think expert suggests almost to me that you've climbed the mountain. You're at the top of the mountain. You know everything there is to know as an expert.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I love writing, and certainly writing history and researching it, is that I find out something new at least every day about whiskey that I didn't know.
Okay.
And every time I find out something new, and sometimes it's a little thing and it's almost just a trivial but humorous or quirky. Other times it's something that you go, "Oh, why did I not think of this before? Why did I not think of this before?" So I consider myself to be a learner. I'm still on the journey up the hill.
Good.
And even when I do if I do ever get to the top of the hill, I'm not sure I want to be called an expert, because I'm sure once you get to the top of the hill, you look up and you see there's one that you couldn't see on the way up. There's always a higher one, which is my depressing experience of walking in the hills in Scotland. It's just so soul destroying.
I think everyone's in that situation, though.
Yeah.
I'm Catholic, so the Pope, I think the Pope could think that the Pope could be a more religious, giving, loving person. I think the Dalai Lama would not consider themselves the pinnacle of what they could be. So I still do think there's got to be a line that someone passes at one point where most people could consider you an expert.
So
maybe not ourselves.
The people I really defer to, Dolph, and this is an area which I said, I think earlier on, really, I don't feel I have a great deal of competence, are the people who have, whatever the process is in their brains and in their sensory equipment, to put a glass of whiskey to their nose and then come out with these really beguiling and real descriptions, not the sort of nonsense ones that some people write as if they've just, it's like AI tasting notes, ChatGPT, write me a tasting note of this. But are the people that can do that. So that's like Michael Jackson, the late Michael Jackson, Dave Broom, Charlie McLean. These people, I think, they have a skill that I cannot imagine having. The other people are actually, I think, the people are the blenders.
Okay.
Because the blenders, and again, it's one of the points I make in the book, because so many people just start holding their nose when they hear the word blend, as if they don't quite realize that, with the exception of a single cask whiskey, everything you drink is blended.
Right.
Whether it's a single malt or a blended Scotch, there has been someone behind that who has got an appreciation of these liquids, who literally on paper might have an idea of what they want the liquid to produce, but then can go and find the different components to deliver what they wrote on paper, on the nose, on the palate, in a bottle, sometimes in 100,000 bottles. I mean, that's quite an achievement, I think, you know, to be able to do that.
And the consistency, and not just in this industry. I read an article where you were referring to somebody in the perfume industry. I think it was coffee and chocolate industry, and trying to show people how those are all blends, and without the blender, it's really quite, I don't want to say stagnant, and I really don't want to, because I love single barrel whiskeys. I love SMWS. I love getting the single barrels. That's what makes me happiest generally. I like my blends, like my Johnny Walker 21 here. It's a great blend. I agree with you. I also like the others, but the blending, it isn't easy. Dr. Don Livermore here, JPY, because I talk to him often, and his ability and his nose and what he expects.
Well, Don, I would have in that. I know Don not fairly well, but we've met at conferences and spoken stuff. I would put him in that same, you know, same league. There are, well, a lot. There might be 20 or 30. I don't know, you know, something like that. But these people are so special, and that is definitely. They have expertise, so they are experts in what they do without any doubt. In the same way as I think the people with all this organoleptic skills and the ability to translate that into words, that's the sort of expertise that I have huge admiration for.
All right, and I see Don on Thursday, actually, before we go to the Banff Whiskey Festival. So I'll tell him that you think he's an expert, and we talked about Eskers and Dr.
Send him my best regards, please.
I shall do that.
Yeah.
All right, on to the next section. So in the section, and let's another quote, as I promised, right there. So in this section, the mystery and magic of whiskey making, you state, for all the science, research, and calibrations, for all the laws and regulations, for all the bamboozling terminology, there still remains an air of mystery around the art of distilling. Why is that? Try as they might, distillers find it impossible to replicate the spirit character of one distillery in another. In recent years, some distillers have tried to find an explanation for this by hijacking the concept of terroir from French winemakers. They have. And in fact, in an act of appropriation of the very worst kind. Just punctuating that at the end. That's great. That's page 37 if people want to look that up. So this is a really bold statement. It is. So could you elaborate on your terroir in whiskey stance, please? And I had this up here just because of that for the terroir. So the Waterford and the Waterford up there. So please, your idea on, and you know what? Not everything, because they can still buy the book. Buy the book. Don't just watch this. Buy the book.
So
they want to know.
So my personal belief is that terroir is so culturally wound up in winemaking, and it's so different. You know, when people talk about terroir in wine, and I remember being in Alsace, and I had private tasting at the Humbrecht winery, and we were tasting wines that had been grown on patches of soil that were about the size of this room. Okay, and they were making different vintages from all of these different little plots. They all had different soils. So the geology slightly changed as you moved around this area. The schist, sometimes they call it. The sunlight was different. You know, the way the cold came in, you know, in the autumn was different. Everything was different, and you could taste it. These wines, it was just astonishing. It was just astonishing. So I very much understand what terroir means in terms of wine production. But it seems to me when you try and just pinch that, and of course, many of the people who were the pioneers of that were from the wine trade. So they knew this phrase in the wine trade, like Marc Reynier, and they decided they would apply it to whiskey. But I think it just doesn't work. And what I do know technically is that if you want to get a real character of the grain of the malt in your whiskey, you have to drink it really young.
Yes.
Right. Now, so whether it's
I would say fresh, no barrel at all, just straight new make.
So I remember talking to Jim McEwen, who was at Brewcladdy at the time, still, and they just started, I think, doing their Isla barley stuff. Very small at the time because they couldn't get many farmers to help them. But they just started, and I remember he told me, and it, you know, when if anyone's heard Jim McEwen speak, you'll know there's a lot of stuff. But even when you got rid of all the stuff, I mean, what he was saying, very genuinely.
Okay.
I mean, he said the taste of this stuff at new make and the texture, he said it's just remarkable. But it starts disappearing from the moment you put it into a cask.
Okay. From
the moment you put it into a cask. So, and this isn't terroir that we're talking about. We're talking about grain influence. You know,
yep.
So it could be malt that you bought from Denmark or Canada or something. You know, because not all Scotch whiskey is made from Scotch barley. So it's this grain character is a transient thing anyway. It's not like wine where, if anything, the terroir character just increases. I mean, I was tasting some old Riesling the other day, or not tasting. I was drinking some old Riesling the other day with a friend here, and it was just remarkable stuff. Yeah, absolutely remarkable. So my own feeling is that terroir, as used in wine, simply does not translate to grain-based spirits. That's it, as far as I'm concerned. And I know there are books that have got sort of lots of science in them and all this sort of stuff, but that's my position. I'm sticking to it. Okay. However, what I would say, and that goes back to the beginning of that quote, this mystery of distilling, right? There is, and this is where I go from cynic to one of the times I go from cynic to romantic, you know, if you will. There is something about every distillery that is unique. There is a distillery footprint, and it's made up of, it's fundamental to the place.
Okay.
It's fundamental to the process that's used in that distillery. I think it's also fundamental to the people
running. Yeah.
So, and by that people thing, I mean, it's like the pineapple. It's not just what they've been taught about making whiskey in that thing. It's what the place teaches them about making whiskey in that thing
over time. Yep.
And there are also environmental things, and I do talk in the book about wild yeasts and stuff like that.
Right.
So there's a lot that goes on inside a distillery, which means you can't move it. You can't
replicate it.
A Glenfarclas on the other side of Elgin and replicate everything in it as it was. You can't do that and expect to get the Glenfarclas that comes from the real Glenfarclas. You know, and famous story is Peter Mackie trying to make Lefroy in the malt mill distillery that he built. It's in the book after he lost his agency for Lefroy. And of course, malt mill distillery made malt mill whiskey because that distilleries make the sort of whiskey they want to make to an extent. I mean, I know that from when Rose Isle, the big Diageo distillery was big Diageo, not big now by any means, tiny compared to some. But when that was built, and they were commissioning it, and they got really clear ideas about what type of spirit it was going to make. And my goodness, that distillery didn't want to make some of that stuff. It wanted to make its own thing. So that's, to me, that's I wouldn't use a terroir. It's this intrinsic thing about the place where this stuff is made. Say place, process, people, environment. Okay. You know,
which is not terroir. We've made the distinction.
And then, sorry, I'll say, without giving it away, there's a very nice story in the book about sausages. Yes. Which I think, I'm not going to say anymore, but I think that brings that to light. And I will also
say, story as well. Yeah.
I will also say, as I always do, thank you, Monique Houston, who told me that story just as I was writing that chapter, and I couldn't believe it. It was what, this is so good. So yeah,
serendipity at its best. And I've got to say, as a writer, I like the style where you will, I don't want to say attack, but I'm going to say attack, where you attack, but you come back at the end. And it's the same thing with this. Yeah, we could bring up words like inferiority complex, ardent want to believers, terroir is less of a grand concept and more of a cash cow. You talk about these, then you bring it back at the end, and the reason's clear. There is something at work beyond the reach of scientists and technocrats that shapes flavor, which determines character. So you still bring it back that there is something there, and something that some people will mistake for terroir, but it's not terroir. And I agree.
Well, that's my view. I mean, other people have different views, and I respect their opinions, broadly speaking. Yeah. But yeah,
not perfect. Okay, you know what? Last question. Let's do the last question for the day. I'm on page 6 of 14 questions that I have for you. But let's make this the last question for you tonight, Dr. Nick. And because we started talking about wood, let's continue there. And let's also have another quote, as I continually do. So we're going to change our foci to whiskey to wood. And there's little doubt that in terms of creating flavors and dictating the character of the whiskeys, like we're speaking of, the blender has to work with. The coopers and the casks they produce are the most important. The coopers are the unsung heroes of Scottish whiskey, and the story of maturation must begin with their ancient craft. And I love this. And I wondered at that time, why don't we talk more often about coopers? And I'm wondering if you know of some coopers that have this godlike status that distillery managers or some distillers had in the past. Can you think of anyone like that?
Oh, well, I had a former colleague, John Carberry, who I would imagine was a master cooper, because within a trade like coopering, you actually do have a master status. And John worked latterly at Diagio's Cambus cooperage.
Okay.
And he was actually spending quite a lot of his time. Well, he did sort of special coopering work when it was, I mean, like very special coopering work when it was required. And also spent a lot of his time working with the apprentices, because they still have a proper apprentice program bringing people through to cooper. So John was always my go-to person on sort of coopering stuff, and he's now actually gone to be a cooper in Australia.
Oh, okay.
But I still occasionally send him coopering relating things. And it's interesting, I was lucky that I spent a lot of time with both Diagio's coppersmiths, because Diageo has its own coppersmithing business called Abercrombie's, in Alloa in Scotland, and then close by the Coopers. And there is I wouldn't say entirely friendly rivalry between the coppersmiths and the Coopers as to which is the most important craft. Because of course coppersmithing is hugely important,
the still the design, how it's made, the thickness, everything. Yes.
Well, yeah, and I've watched a young man hammering on a little curve of copper that was going to go as a replacement part into a still at a distillery, famous distillery, Diageo distillery, and it was going to take him about 5 weeks just to hammer that one part to get it to the right shape to go in, so that it didn't screw up whatever it was that happened in the stills at this distillery.
Help me out, because if they have that piece, and let's say he does replicate it to the exact specifications he wants, how do they then attach that to the still itself? It's melted.
This is part of the neck. This is part of the neck. In the past, it would have been riveted.
Okay.
Then, of course, they started soldering, because soldering techniques improved. So when I first went into distilleries, I never saw a rivet. There were all these beautiful, smooth copper pot stills. And then probably about 15 years ago, maybe slightly more, the technical guys decided that actually getting the rivets back was a good idea, because it made replacing bits a lot more straightforward,
Okay.
So now if you go into distilleries, you'll probably see a mixture of riveted stills and still smooth stills. But I imagine if you were to go into a distillery in 10 years' time, most of them would all have riveted stills, which is the old-fashioned style. That's what you see in Alfred Barnard. You see rivets all over the place,
Okay, sorry to get you off track.
Okay. So there's this rivalry between coppersmiths and coopers, and I realized that I was putting my head on the block on this one, and I really hope I didn't offend all my former coppersmithing colleagues or coppersmiths anywhere else. That was not the intention. But there's this debate of, well, where does the flavor come from in whiskey? And there's people will say, well, 60% comes from the woods, 70% comes from whatever it is. I'm not really that bothered about statistics. It's materially evident that casks are hugely important for delivering the final flavor of the whiskey, and those casks are made, prepared, looked after, rejuvenated, a whole range of processes that go on by these highly trained men doing a job which, although I'm not sure if you've been to a cooperage in Canada or United States or in Scotland, but although it's an automated process, at the end of the day, it's down to the old coopers, medieval coopers tools are still being used to do the really important jobs in this process. And most of the mechanization actually has been being used for over 100 years. Hoop drivers and things that get the metal hoops down on the casks and stuff like that. So I think the coopers are really important. And one of the things I remember, someone, I can't remember who, saying to me when I was at the cooperage, Camas cooperage one day, and we were watching, guy was working on a cask, I think rejuvenating, so shaving out the inside of the cask and stuff like that. And so he sent it off to go on to its next stage in the process of its journey. And he said, I probably won't see that one again in my career.
Okay.
So they're making these casks, and they could be used for 15, 20, 25 years, and then they'll come back and someone else will love them for a while, and then they'll go back. Casks can last for about 100 years,
Well, and now that they're STR'd and more, although I don't know if those ones are used for 25-year-old whiskeys. I think, I'm guessing, generally the STR shaved, toasted, recharred casks are probably a short-term maturation, because the color is it's gonna get the wood character pretty quickly.
It depends on what you do to the cask in the cooperage, how long you can use it for. I mean, rejuvenated casks do have a very different flavor profile from casks. Normally in Scotland, obviously, casks that have just come across from the US, broken down and made up into hogsheads. Yeah. First fill is for grain whiskey, normally in Scotland, and then you'll start putting malt whiskey into it. Probably won't be rejuvenated until it's maybe 20, 25, 30 years into that process.
And then the shelf life on those ones, are you thinking it's close, half, or even more than half?
Well, again, it depends. It depends. In theory, you can rejuvenate a cask and use it for another 25 years. Then it can come back. You can rejuvenate it again. Obviously, if you take a lot of stuff on the inside, then the structure will be compromised. So, it's a very delicate process. And if you overchar and overscrape and all the rest of it, you will lose the cask altogether. And that's not the intention of the work that's done in Scotland. It's a very gentle process. You just want to bring that cask back to life a bit.
Well, I heard it's 2 or 3 millimeters that they're taking off. Sometimes more if it's a char 4 or the alligator char they use for bourbon, if certain bourbons. But 2 or 3 millimeters out of, is it 10 centimeter wide that they roughly are at first? So maybe it will. Maybe. I don't know how many times they could do it. And Dr. Swan's not with us to tell us that, but it would be kind of nice to know.
Well, like I say, I think you could do it 3 or 4 times. That gives you a 100-year cask,
Nice. Are there coopers that are sought after from one company to the other? So if Diageo hears of a cooper somewhere,
no, I think once you're a cooper in a particular cooperage, you're not going to move.
Are you there? Okay.
I never got a sense of that happening. Certainly, my knowledge of Diageo. What I did know was that lots of people who had young men who'd come into, and women in fact, who'd come into Diageo in sort of more general laboring positions, like just moving casks around, cask handling, stuff like that. Many of those, by the time they were in their mid-20s, went, hang on a minute, I really want to be a cooper. So most of the apprentices have been in the business for 3 or 4 years doing more manual work, and then take a pay cut to do a 3-year apprenticeship to become proper coopers.
But then paid quite a bit more over all the other years. So they must treat them well to keep them there.
Yeah. No, they're treated very well. And they're looked after. So a lot of the mechanization in the modern cooperages is all about saving the backs and the bodies of coopers, so there's no rolling or very little rolling casts around anymore and stuff like that.
We keep seeing that on YouTube videos. I like it.
Of course we do.
It's
Yeah. Why damage the health of these really valuable workers when you can work with them to figure out better ways of doing stuff? That's what they've done, So, but I think trades like coopers, really, you get into somewhere and you stay. That's it.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to leave it up to you for last comments before I wrap everything up. Is there something that we should have done today? Something I should have said that I didn't get to?
No. I mean, I know we haven't answered all your questions, but maybe I can come back and do that on another occasion, which I'd be very happy to do.
Oh, we'd love to do that always. So this was fantastic. It was fun. So
thank you.
That's all the time we have today, Whiskey brothers, sisters, and friends. It's been a fantastic morning, early afternoon for me, evening for this gentleman right here. Thanks to our listeners who joined us today, and mostly for those of you that come in the future. A very big thank you to Dr. Nick Morgan. Maybe not just have the pleasure of finishing this one, but I do want to read this with you as well. So I'm hopefully going to have you on several times in the future.
Well, as you can tell, there's nothing I like better than a very good whiskey conversation. So I'm always happy to do that.
And I'm happy to have it with you. And I'll be drinking whiskey as we do it that time. Wrapping it up. Sorry, my wife's doing this. Wrap it up. I'm trying to save you so you can have dinner at some type of honorable time. So I'm going to see you all in 3 weeks when we interview Hans Offringa discussing malts and jazz. So as a final note, if you don't want to miss a minute of any of these programs episodes, click like, click subscribe. And as always, here's to good company. This gentleman right here. Here's to good food. Not food. Whiskey. I'm thinking about food now. That's why I'm doing it. And here's to good conversation. Sláinte, sir. Thank you very much. And I will see you again very soon. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.